internal group. And then before doing anything else, would say a huge thank you to everyone who has been involved in making Kernel happen. If you haven't met Sachin and Angela yet, you need to. They're wonderful, and you probably have, because they've been talking to so many people and in contact in so many different ways. You might have seen pods, definitely seen Sachin in some one-on-ones, and they have been the lifeblood of making sure that everything we do in Kernel is smooth, and we get to the point where we have a Juntos infrastructure, we have pods infrastructure, and so that we can get to this introductory conversation and do more. So Sachin, Angela, I want to start by saying thank you to you both. You've given us many gifts that we'll be exploring to kick off today. So some of those will be shown right here in this doc. I'm going to try to go pretty quickly through my portion and get Andy in the mix, where we'll talk for about 40 minutes, hopefully in a collaborative way with many people in the chat and unmuting to chime in about the first week's syllabus. But I want to just do a refresher. Everyone's seen these slides now a couple of times, but maybe these faces mean a little bit more. Simona's orange hair, I hope you've seen already somewhere in one of these events. John is a real person in real life too, and I know many people have talked to him one-on-one. Angela, Sachin, myself, and Andy, we are here, and we're always down to chat. I'm definitely behind on my DMs, but that doesn't mean that I'm not looking at them, and I will be getting back to them soon. And yeah, we're around, and more importantly, you're here. So I hope that these names of schools and education backgrounds and companies have been better shown in the people that you've met behind them, that of course matter more than where they've gone to school or what they've done before. Everyone here is of course incredibly technically competent, but the hope is that we build an intentional environment to explore together. And so I have been really enjoying the icebreakers, the stuff after the Kernel kickoff, and appreciative of everyone for joining, participating, meeting others, and all of the energy that we've gotten from people about their early experiences. So we're excited to keep it going. You know a bit about these terms now. You know what your adventure is. You've been introduced to a pod channel in Slack. You have some tracks that you've picked. Those tracks will get rolling next week. And you know that there is this book that we've been talking about, and hopefully you've read a chapter of it, and then these juntos that you might be able to participate in. So that's all stuff that hopefully means more than it did the first time you saw it in kickoff just 6 days ago, which is kind of crazy. The network is something that I think you'll see the power of starting tomorrow and starting next week. We've been very intentional about this first week being about the people in the block, but this group is about to be brought into the fold and about to be added to the mix. We hope that you help us in welcoming them to Block 3. The mentors experience as peer mentors is something that matters a lot to us. We want them to also feel very welcome and very excited to be around, and they have very good reason to. Just be yourselves, and that's pretty much all you have to do. And you'll meet many of them in office hours. Yeah. So yeah, with that, you've seen these before, but I want to pass the mic to Andy. And there's a few different things to share here. I'm just going to show a quick preview of the slides to come, all of which come from the new Kernel website, which kudos to Andy and Rajan, Foster Rajan, being a member of Block 3, who we already got involved from the Maker ecosystem to help us build out this new website. And there's so much to be said. We'll dive into these principles because the book is still the main portion of the website, but there's some interesting things that Andy has put in here about our intentions in Kernel, about these flashcards that you might have noticed on the pages as you read through the syllabus. And then we will get into topics more related to play of pattern, and trust, which are the modules for this week. So I want to pass it to Andy. I'll just be background dancing for him from here.
I expect at least one shoe up along the way, otherwise I don't know what they're paying you for.
I need Antonio to help me here, you know.
There we go. Yeah, so we've got.
I will. Indeed.
There we go. Thank you very much. So yes, as Vivek mentioned in the kickoff last week, Kernel is not just about teaching technical skill. It's about the modes and patterns required to flourish in decentralized communities more generally. And one way of going about describing that, not perhaps the only way, but certainly the way that we do at Kernel, is to think about Web3 principles and the complementarity between that and how we approach the rest of life. In some sense, a lot of the work that we try to do is to integrate more fully the so-called professional realm of our life with the rest of it. These principles are therefore kind of designed both to give you insight into how the course itself is structured, but also into the inner meaning and the deep intention behind why it's structured this way. So it's not just this kind of thing that you see built in a specific way, but one in which the intention is to reveal, you know, why we do the things that we do. So you can see, I won't read through everything that's on the slide, you can do that for yourselves, but the critical points of the Web3 principles are really about these words which get bandied about so often, but as Paul Myberg says in week 0, you know, words fall out of people's mouths as easily as possible with as little meaning as necessary. And Kernel, through combining Web3 and personal principles, is really intended to put the meaning back into these words like trust, value, freedom, meaning, governance, liberal radicalism, all the rest. You know, what does scalability actually mean? What is a gift? These are words that we use very, very often and which seem very simple, and they are, but too infrequently are the times when we really get to explore, what does this mean? What is trust? What does it mean to trust another human being? What does it mean to experience trustworthiness? And in order to do that, you can't just speak about the technical specificities of VRNS or how the EVM works or what a network of timestamp servers really is as described in the Bitcoin white paper. You need to understand something more about yourself. You need to understand something more about the observer, the person who is interpreting these words. And in that sense, we have to understand what patterns make up ourselves, how meaning is experienced in our own lives. We have to look clearly and as deeply as we possibly can at the kinds of questions which dominate our existence and which too often we shy away from. We have to consider our intentions. We have to listen to each other. We have to learn how to tell better stories, how to attach the meaning that really matters to our words. We have to learn how to govern ourselves, right? We have to learn how to love and how to love learning. And we have to give. More than anything, this is what Kernel is about. It's about giving of yourself until self and other lose the distinction that so often rules our separate interactions. If you go to the next slide, Vivek, perhaps, you know, one of the most efficient and certainly the straightest path towards this kind of inquiry, which merges both the professional with the personal and integrates the experience of our lives so that we don't exist in these separate boxes all of the time, is service, right? One serves and serves and serves because it brings us back constantly to humility, and it brings us back more and more and more to seeing the kinds of questions which define how the self works and the kinds of patterns along which it runs. You know, if you pick any path, it doesn't really matter what it is, but service is really a greatly revealing one in this regard. You get to see all of the patterns through which the self operates, right? The first and most obvious of this is that, you know, as soon as I put myself in a position of service, I find that's the particular shadow of, oh, you know, I'm now somebody who helps, and I'm better. I have a greater insight into life. I know, you know, I'm putting myself behind others and constantly you know, putting my own desires and things out of the way, and therefore, you know, I'm all of a sudden a much more enlightened person. And of course, this is just the first step along the path of genuine self-knowledge, which is to see that to see it clearly, to understand this particular pattern and how the self operates, so that you can see that this is not what service is about at all, right? Service is about recognizing that, again, in truth, there is no otherness, that all you're ever doing are serving yourself, but you have to understand what that self is, which is, again, part of the reason for the personal principles, part of the reason for highlighting again and again and again throughout this course the need for humility both in a cybernetic sense, in a technical sense, in a personal sense, in relationships across the entire spectrum. This is the glue often that binds together much of what we will be presenting in the next 8 weeks.
Yeah. And just to chime in, it's great that humility and this concept that we are each other's environment we're talking about now, because this in the website is not even in module 0 yet. This is still in the kind of start, the exploration of the syllabus. And then, very soon with play of pattern and trust, we get into those topics more deeply. So we're coming back to those. Yeah, we are, again and again. I'm going to sound like a broken record by the end of the course. That much I can promise you. All of that said, in order to understand the self in wider and wider situations, circumstances, and experiences, we have to have some kind of common and shared purpose, right? It's only really through relationship with others that we can understand our own individuality. In South Africa, and in fact in the rest of Africa, there is this very specific term called Ubuntu, which comes from the Zulu phrase umuntu gomuntu gabantu, which means a human being is only a human being through other human beings. So in this phrase, you have the possibility of full and total individuation, the possibility of being a real human being, but it's only possible in relationship with others. And so we have to have this common external purpose. And my proposal for this, it's not set in stone by any stretch of the imagination, is the single sentence, right? To serve the continued creation of free money. Because it captures for me so much of my own approach and what I think is important in the Web3 space in general, which again begins with service. This is not software as a service, it's software as service. And what we are serving is this notion of continuity. That's really what brings belonging. It's what underpins so much of our fundamental psychological drives as human beings, is this pursuit of continuity, which is something we can unpack in another week. And then, this idea of free money, what does that really mean? It certainly doesn't mean that we give dollar bills away without expecting anything in return. There is something much, much more important and deep to think about in terms of what free money actually means, what its links to sovereignty are, what its links are to peer-to-peer rather than master-slave architectures and various other things, which we will discuss in some of the next slides. So if you move. Wonderful. Yeah, the one thing I wanted to point out in the chat, Marcel, with our first great question, what is money? What is free? Should it not be the continued creation of free value? Which is another word we play with, Marcel. But
so value, it's a great question, and value comes up in week 2, module 1, and certainly, I think that that's something that we can consider there, because that particular module and that particular piece looks very, very carefully at this term value and considers all of its different connotations. I chose money particularly because the point of these kinds of common and shared purposes is the reimagination of old and common words in unexpected ways. That's what grabs the attention of people, and these need to be attention-grabbing phrases, right? So free money immediately calls up this notion of getting rich quickly as a result of some unexpected gift of dollar bills. But as soon as you dive even one step into the Kernel syllabus, or indeed many other places in Web3, it's not unique to Kernel, you will find this particular examination of what is money and what is freedom taking place in various different ways. Both of these things are considered at length in Kernel, and money and speech is in module 2, and freedom, I think, is module 2 or module 3. So value, freedom, money, and speech will all come up in the course, and hopefully I'll get to talk more about this then. The other thing to kind of mention before Vivek does his dance and peppers me with both delightful background noises and more questions is this notion of free learning, initially called the Neconomic medium. This is, it also comes from a part in the kernel course, which we will get to in a later week, but very, very simply, we want to design a continuous online learning environment that is powered by tokens. What that means more specifically is that we're really, really bad as human beings at remembering what it is that we read. And yet we have these new online continuous environments which we can sculpt and program to address some of our own biological shortcomings, in particular, this inability to master and remember detail upon first reading. So there is some really, really great cognitive science backed by some incredible researchers out of Khan Academy and just the internet in general, called Andy Matushak and Michael Nielsen, who have written a series of essays on quantum computers using spaced repetition flashcards, very similar to what you will find in Anki or Duolingo or any of these language learning apps, which also use spaced repetition. Because the science shows that when you have these kind of reflected questions which highlight the critical aspects of things that you need to learn, and you let people go through them in a spaced repetitive manner, it increases our ability to master the detail tenfold or more, such that we can come to a place where we can analyze and synthesize and think creatively much quicker. So you will find the first instantiation of these flashcards in the current syllabus. Hopefully they will point you to what we consider to be most important, and hopefully they will delight and make you laugh at some point along the way. There is no spaced repetition formally built in at the moment that is in the works, but just using the flashcards in and of themselves should hopefully be a good experience that helps you learn more easily and helps you take a slower and more reflective approach to some of the content that is presented, because the idea is not to overwhelm you with information. The idea is to transform the ways that you think, and that only happens if you take what is easy for you. So allow these flashcards to highlight the parts which are easiest and most relevant in the syllabus. Don't worry about trying to learn the whole thing. Just take what is easy for you, delight in the experience of a medium which is built specifically and with the intention to make it easy to remember what it is you're reading, and give us feedback about how we can improve it.
Hear, hear. Very excited for feedback. Very grateful for all the comments in the chat, Carmen. That's incredible. Well, I'm hoping we'll get back to that idea and Wittgenstein, which is slightly easier to say than mechanomic. So Carmen, please be ready. I'd love for you to join us to talk about that at some point in a second. I wanted to share my first reading through the syllabus with some of these flashcards. It was different for me, having read the syllabus 2 to 3 times and feeling that it is very much a spot that you can come back to and explore and see different things every time you go through it. That's the nature of the syllabus, and it's been built in such a way that the hope is that the syllabus remains quite steady for the next 5 to 10 years in Web3, and the tracks change in kernel as things change in the ecosystem, as people focus on different things that they're actually building, but that these concepts stay the same. So it's been nice to have the flashcards to bring up different ideas. A couple of the ones that stood out to me that maybe can keep the conversation going with play of pattern are these words that are, I think, really important ones in the play of pattern. The first one that's brought up that I got correct in my flashcard is this idea of complementary opposites, otherwise termed as quantum thought, the ability to hold the possibility of both a 0 and a 1, both a yes and a no, and all of the different options in between. Basically, the gray area is the way that I understand it. And how so many of our decisions when we build in Web3 and build in technology live in a gray area, where you can't really say, okay, this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do. Everything by nature is experimentation. And the only thing that we have to guard ourselves from external sources of, let's say, input that that can lead us down wrong paths with our building is this idea of humility, which seems kind of glib, but I'd love to dive in on the word and why that's true. And the statement that really stood out to me was, if you want to change the world will inevitably act back and change you. And if you've been around me in Kernel so far, one of the things that I've had kind of a visceral reaction to is whenever somebody now says the phrase, I want to change the world. And that to me has been a phrase that we've used in the technology industry over and over again. And there's nothing wrong with it when we think about play of pattern and 0 and 1, but it forgets so often, what about you? What about your experience with the technologies? And when you get to the point where you have CEOs of huge technology companies saying, I don't want my kids using this thing, it feels like somewhere in the process, something has gone wrong. And that ability to kind of think about those things together is why there's 8 Web3 lessons, but there's also 8 personal lessons. And I'm curious if, Andy, there's anything else from Play of Pattern you'd like to share.
Absolutely, yeah. Where does humility come from? It comes from this lived experience that the more I learn, the less I know. But again, when you live an honestly reflective and examined life, not only is the only result of that gratitude beyond reason or measure, it's also absolute humility, because you know so little compared to what the universe is. And we can express this in purely scientific terms by saying that the physics that we have can comment on and describe only between 5 and 10% of the entire universe. The rest is just termed dark energy or dark matter, the unknown, right? And that's in a very specific physical sense, let alone to talk about human psychology, the inner cosmology, the realms and journey of the self. You know, the only response to this kind of genuine reflection is humility. And the reason for this is that what I'm really talking about in complementary opposites, you know, like quantum thought is one way, it's a neat and kind of attention grabbing way of talking about it. But what I really mean is something a little bit deeper than that, right? Because quantum thought is often used in a way which makes it sound similar to what in academia is called the scholastic mode, this ability to hold competing ideas in mind and not grasp after certainty or facts, but remain in that uncertain and fecund space between what John Keats called negative capability. But I'm after something a little bit deeper here, right? Which is to see both sides of the spectrum, the up and the down, the north and the south, the attraction, the repulsion, the good and the bad, the light and the dark, the DeFi and the traditional finance. To see the entire spectrum between them, right, which is the quantum realm of thought in some sense, to see the opposites that define that spectrum, but then to go deeper in your inquiry as well and ask, what is the pattern which underlies both of these, right? It's not just about seeing the spectrum of possibility defined by those opposites, but you know, that pattern which sort of underlies every spectral duality we experience in space and time. You know, and there's no one who can provide you with a satisfactory answer to that, because we've moved beyond the age of prophecy, right? We're each looking kind of only for the pattern yourself. And that's why in this piece, at the end, we present these 2 questions. You know, what is the question to which you are the universe's answer? And its immediate corollary, which is how can you answer most honestly, accurately, and lovingly? And the choice of those 3 words and the order in which they put is very, very specific, because if you're going to understand the pattern which underlies these spectral dualities, which we are constantly experiencing, as long as you're breathing, as long as you're in space and time, you are confronted by duality. There is no escape. The Buddhists talk about this in terms of the freedom of no escape, right? And I'm interested in that freedom, because it's one thing to see the spectrum of possibilities, to understand that there are always these opposite poles of our experience, to see that it's not really about choosing one pole, but deciding clearly and consciously where you make your own trade-off. But why? It's still the question of why make any trade-off? Why act? Why continue living, right? So it's Albert Camus' only question of philosophy is why continue living? And for me, you know, in order to see this freedom of no escape, this pattern which underlies the constant interplay of complementary opposites, it requires honesty first, Honesty before anything, because it is the straightest line between head and heart and the means of connecting them permanently. But not just honesty, right? Then accuracy, because you have to attend fully to the world as it presents itself if you want to see more and more clearly the unified pattern within, between, and beyond it. And finally, love, right? Which is the foundation of all trust. And that kind of leads us into the other more personal piece, but linked to Web3 of this week, which is, like, how do we talk about trust? Well, we begin with the second aspect of the question, which is accuracy, because like the whole perspective in trust is that verification does not mitigate trust. In fact, trust only begins where verification ends. And kind of what we're really asking in that piece and the underlying drive in it is like, what are we really being accurate about when we're trying to understand trust? Come back to this question that I asked at the beginning, like, what is trust? How do we talk about it? How can we be accurate about what trust actually is in a human sense? And for me, it's about negation, right? So in that piece, in a technical sense, what we can say is that, like, if you want to, we can't maybe describe exactly what trust is, but we can understand it more fully by defining and encoding all the possible lies within a given context. We can define and encode in executable software rules what it means to cheat. And this is what I mean by you can be accurate about negation. Again, it comes up in multiple different wisdom traditions from across the world and across time and space, which is in Sanskrit, neti, neti, right? Not this, not this, not this. In Arabic, la ilaha, right? It's not this. So we can be very, very accurate about negating like what trust is not, sculpting this empty space that then allows us to explore increasingly diverse, richly connected and interesting trust spaces in an interpersonal sense. And, one of the interesting things about thinking about trust in terms of accuracy and how it applies to this question of who I am and what question I'm, the universe's answer to, is that there has been a shift in how accurate we can be about what it means to lie because of the change in the language with which value is defined. Right? Because we have this language, this executable text, which is executed in a deterministic and public way, it's more honest, right? The accountability which the medium enforces on the message means we can express shared truths more clearly. And that's really fascinating. It's kind of the heart of the trust piece, although there's many other things which I hope to explore in Yuntos with various different people over the week ahead. But this notion that the medium enforces accountability onto the message by virtue of its public and deterministic execution is what Andreas Antonopoulos is talking about in the first of the curated briefs when he's talking about intrinsic utility rather than intrinsic value. He mentions how innovating on the architecture of money means that no one will control the expression of economic value in exactly the same way that no one controls the meaning of words. Right? The meaning of words are arrived at consensually through common use. And the same should be true of economic value, particularly in peer-to-peer networks that have moved away from this master-slave architecture. And in fact, in an even deeper sense, right, money is a linguistic technology, which is what it's always been. It has always had to do about the scale at which we can play these coordination games. And the scale is now planetary and the games are infinite. So what are we going to say? And that's kind of, I suppose, like the big drive of Module 1 in general is what kind of conversations are we cultivating? Again, Andreas in that piece on Money Talks, he talks about how we have this network-centric form of money, which represents a phase change in the expressive power of money. So instead of just, being tradable, you can now actually program money to do stuff dynamically. And programming incentives in a network-centric manner where meaning is arrived at consensually provides no less than the possibility to broaden human consciousness. So that's kind of a really interesting thought, right? Like, what does it mean? Nice words, but what does it mean to broaden the horizons of human consciousness? And that brings me back to honesty, right? Why we begin with how can you answer most honestly? Because networked expression suggests a truth outside myself. And this is where the questions come up in Kernel, like, what is this truth? How can I hear it? How do I know when I've heard it? How can I speak it? How can I live it? How can I live with it? How can I do everything I do, every single moment of my life with this singular truth? And how can I use the intrinsic utility of a new order of languages to find my way back into fundamental relationship with everything around me? These are fascinating questions for me, and I'm certainly not going to present any answers because the answers are your own. But the piece on artful conversation with Paul Myberg is fundamentally about this. When he talks about coming back from spending 7 years in the Kalahari with the Gui Bushmen, he says, I missed true voice. I missed the stars. I missed the wind. I missed my relationship with the land, and I missed true voice. What is that? What does it mean, true voice? What is this truth outside ourselves that can only be explored in conversation, in genuine, open, sincere, and vulnerable dialogue, which is fundamentally about trust spaces that exist between human beings once we've encoded clearly what it means to cheat, so that we can get on with the transactional realm of reality and still operate in these more quantum ways, which are not just about winning and losing, but about continuing the game infinitely, about playing and playing and playing with each other, because to play is joyful, right? In the same sense that we don't dance for any other reason other than the dance itself. You don't dance to reach a particular place on the floor. You dance for the joy of dancing. You don't talk with someone to gain something. Conversations in Kernel are not about benefiting from the other people. They're about cultivating presence, awareness, and attentiveness to others, not because you can gain anything from them, but because cultivating those characteristics in yourself is its own reward. So, this particular line of questioning about true voice and how I can imbue everything I do with it, it goes to the heart of the final link in that conversation piece, which is something that I'd really love to explore more also in another Yunsa. We haven't really had the chance in other kernel blocks yet, which is that it goes to the heart of this kind of coherent common consciousness capable of thinking together, which is what so inspired this physicist David Bohm and Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was a great sage. They came up with a whole means of dialogue as a way of exploring coherent common consciousness and a way of thinking together. And one good way of finding your own answers to this as we explore the space that we're creating over the next 8 weeks is Van Gogh's question in that final piece. Right? He says, for what then could I be of use? For what could I serve? And this notion of service, again, it links back to what I've been talking about. And it brings us, to the seal of this week's work, which is love. We talked about honesty. We talked about accuracy, how it relates to trust, how trust leads us through these new kinds of languages, which force us to be more honest as a result of their accountable and public execution. And finally, in order to understand more and more of the why beneath all of this stuff, it's Van Gogh's letter to his brother, and he says, I'm always inclined to believe that the best way of knowing is to love a great deal. Love that friend, that person, that thing, whatever you like, you'll be on the right path to knowing more thoroughly afterwards. That's what I say to myself. But you must love with a high, serious, intimate sympathy, with a will, with intelligence, and you must always seek to know more thoroughly, better, and more. This is, in some way, there's nothing more that can be said after that. It's just love.
This is my cue, and maybe Antonio's, to just start a little bit of movement. Andy, my friend, he's back. I'm very, very grateful for my friendship with Andy. It was the reason that Kernel is what it is. The idea, in Titans was to try to build a syllabus that was focused on finance. And I knew that Britt was an incredible human being who had put together thoughts for years around the financial industries and his personal life that he could weave together in a very similar format, personal lessons and finance lessons was how Titans was set up. And I feel so grateful that I've met Andy, who has taught me so much about Web3 in a way that focuses first on the people. So we have some time, and there's some wonderful chatter. So if anyone wants to chat, and maybe if I could prioritize a Carmen, Ryanan, Tegan, anyone who's been leaving some comments that wants to ask a question or say what they think. Would love to hear it.
Oh God, prioritize. I shouldn't have said anything. No, I shouldn't. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, I guess you can hear me. Yeah, gosh, there's a lot going on and I love it. And I love everything that you said that has made me think so much about what's happening here. One of the comments though, and this might be, it's not going to be philosophical at all. One of the comments in Slack is that on Canada says they're feeling very emotional during this. And I was wondering, it seems to be a shift then between living in a world where we talk about finance and it not being emotional, right? We know that this sort of world is overwhelmed by DeFi at the moment. But I'm just thinking, does this mean that this next wave of technology, let's call it that, is now driven by something more emotional, something that relies more on our interconnectedness than what we previously have been? Is that what you're aiming for with creating Kernel, do you think?
I think it's a great question. And thank you for asking and for having the bravery to step forward first, because it's really, horizontal conversations, as highlighted in the other slide, are really what we're about. It's not presenting answers. And in particular, this kind of question is difficult to answer. It's about exploring the space of truth amongst ourselves, because there are so many different realities. And it's not possible to say that like the tech is trending in this specific way when we really exist within like a garden of forking memes. This is another piece that comes up in module 4 if you are interested in that kind of thing. There's a great essay from Aaron Lewis which talks about how the internet, and in particular more modern technologies like blockchains, have caused these forking memes, different experiences of reality, different experiences of time, different experiences of the prevailing narratives. And I think more than anything, that's what I see, is not one sort of coherent, interconnected way of doing things, but a vast web of forking memes. My intention with Kernel in particular was to give a gift. It's no more or less complicated than that. That Kernel is genuinely a gift to a very good friend, which has had difficult to predict and hugely delightful consequences as a result of that. I'm careful of saying that it's about building this vastly interconnected emotional realm, because that means different things to different people and they will experience it in different ways. I'm deeply touched when people have emotional responses to a lot of what's in here and a lot of the ways in which we organize, because that has become a part of the intention, because we learn best with emotional connection to a subject. And my personal biased belief is that we absolutely should integrate our intellectual approach with life to our emotional one, because it's more efficient. And in fact, the subconscious mind processes 5 orders of magnitude more information than the conscious mind. Not 5 times, 5 orders of magnitude more. And we should tap into that. That's a very interesting way of cognizing the world, of recognizing the world. So personally, I'm like, hell yes, emotional connection is absolutely what it should be about. But I'm careful of like that word should, because it's what it should be about for me. But this is, if people have a very dry and technical intellectual experience of the syllabus, fantastic. and of their journey in Web3, fantastic. It's not, you can still do very valuable things with that kind of approach. It's not to look down on it. But sure, on a personal level, I will put my flag in the ground and say, yeah, we've got to be emotional. Otherwise, again, I always come back to this question of why. Like if you don't feel passionate and you don't burn up about this, whatever you're doing, it doesn't matter whether it's Web3 or music or dance. croquet, whatever. You don't, you know.
This is a bit off topic, but I come back to this little story so many times. I used to do yoga with Goldie, who's a DJ. I don't know if any of you know him. Anyway, after a class, I cried in the class, and I came outside and I was sitting next to him, and I said, "Oh, have you ever cried in a class before?" And he said, "I cry all the time. Life is emotional. That's just it. It's emotional. All of life is emotional. We cry all the time." So yes. Anyway, I think of that every time anything like comes up with regards to any kind of emotional. The comments. Oh my god. Okay. Sorry. Didn't name drop. Okay. Fine.
Yeah, Carmen. Yeah, you're now going to be autograph requests incoming from everybody. I wanted to pass the mic to Anne, who's willing to speak, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vivek. I like I was saying, I think in Slack and also in the chat, like I'm feeling emotional and I'm trying to like process what that is and struggling a bit with that. But something I truly believe in as someone who has a background in organic chemistry, I minored in neuroscience in college. I believe so deeply in emotions being part of logic. I believe that so deeply in my soul. And I think that I'm emotional in this space because I feel like I can bring emotion and that won't be invalidated. Because my greatest accomplishments, you know, the most brilliant things I've come up with in life have come from emotion. You know, they haven't come from this like, you know, I think I think like this kind of like, you know, like you talk about finance, like this dude bro, like super like, I don't feel emotions, like that's not my MO. Like that's never where I've found brilliance. And I am emotional, I think, in this space because I'm like, finally I can bring, I feel like that vulnerability and it won't be like, you know, and you're too emotional. And so that is exciting to me. And I guess we'll see how this space evolves and like, you know, how this cohort feels and all those different things. But I'm excited because I think moving forward and specifically in crypto, I want to divorce the idea that logic is, you know, mutually exclusive from emotion and integrate Web3 into that understanding and say, no, emotion empowers us to understand ourselves and then to understand other people. So that's where those are the things spin around in my head.
Amazing.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. You're not too emotional and you're most welcome. Also, just to explore that, my comment on this is that and hopefully it will appeal to your science background, is that it's one of the reasons why quantum thoughts as a kind of catch-all term for this notion of complementary opposites of both and then beyond thinking is that, you know, like it's really interesting when you think of complementarity in a very physical sense, right? Complementarity being the principle that Niels Bohr used to describe how the laws in quantum mechanics need to match those in the classical worlds, although they operate in different zones. There is the seamless connection between the world of quantum mechanics and subatomic particles and the material physical reality that we experience. Though the laws are slightly different, they meet. You know, that's another way of thinking about complementarity in a very scientific sense. And it's often the way that I approach this negotiation of logic and emotion. I'm with you that there's nothing separate in the world, right? These are not separate things, but they are in some sense zones which have their own unique courtesy, approach, and equations, if we want to use that particular metaphor of, you know, and having the discrimination and skill to be able to read the context of like when the deeply emotional response is most appropriate and contextual and when a slightly more distanced and analytical approach is going to like hit home more has been a constant exploration for me. I'm not certainly not presenting myself as having completely understood this particular thing. But it's interesting, right, to think in these separate but seamlessly connected zones that each have their own courtesy. It's something I think about often, because you're right. Logic powered by emotion is much more insightful. It's just about reading the context.
Yeah, both ends. I think we have a bit of time still, just for everyone's context. I think probably 15, 20 more minutes of exploring here. Lots of hands raised, which we're really excited about. So maybe starting with Rahul, maybe with Alex, Antonio, Tony, Tegan. So we'll weave through, and then 20 minutes at the end for breakouts, just to hang out. But go ahead, Rahul.
Yeah, all the conversations that we've been having so far, I definitely feel the emotional quality that has come from, I feel, just this community of honest and open people looking to give gifts, in the words of Andy. So I think, like, I came into this community really trying to look at the economics of Web3, and I guess like cryptocurrency and everything is super financial, and as much as like Web3 will be about aligning incentives, I think to tie it to this emotional quality, like it's also going to be about aligning emotions as well, right? So in each of our decision making, right? Like I go to business school, and I keep talking to people who graduated and have gone on to work at like Goldman Sachs and in the finance industry as a whole, and it constantly feels like the emotions that are required for such an industry are not like reflected in like what people actually want to do, right? So it eats up at you inside of you, and it's just amazing to imagine a world where those types of, like highly paying and incentivized jobs are the ones that prioritize honesty, authenticity, trust, creativity, and adding value to your community, right? Like, so yeah, I just thought of that idea. It's really something that like I'll be thinking about a little bit more over the course of this.
I love that, Rahul. Just to riff on it for a second, this is one of my favorite parts of Antonopoulos' Money Talks talk. First, for the record, this is one of his earliest talks. It's probably 5 or 6 years old, maybe right after Ethereum, but Ethereum is not even mentioned. But the main idea here is that Bitcoin represents the step change from client-server money to peer-to-peer money. And client-server money could also be described, and he does describe, as master-slave money, which is a very visceral thing to say, but one where he describes you have one governing body that controls all of the money, and all of these people have to serve the interests of that governing body. Whereas peer-to-peer money, he didn't know at the time that Ethereum might be what it was, and like the implications. And I don't think we know the implications of peer-to-peer money, but the initial steps that the industry has taken seem to point towards this tie of the emotions of money with basically the communities of people who have it. And the ways that you can build trusted spaces that have valuable outcomes amongst themselves, and then the currencies that they transact in grow in the value that's been imbued through them. We don't know exactly how that plays out, but it's definitely interesting. And I think about that all the time when we're talking about trust spaces, and even a spot like Kernel, or as an example, when we talk about social tokens now, and you build a community of people who really care about a particular artist, and now perhaps can do really cool things with each other and can get to know each other better because there's financial incentives to get to know each other that are actually emotional incentives before financial ones. I would join a Kendrick Lamar social token community partially because yeah, maybe there's something cool to be gained from that, but more because I want to meet 30 other deep Kendrick Lamar fans, not just somebody who clicked play on Spotify, but somebody who went to one of his first concerts. And if I could be introduced to that, there's an implicit shift, right? I don't need Instagram or Facebook or anyone to make those connections for me. There's a peer-to-peer connectability that the internet has that has emotional connections at its core, financial connections. Maybe to keep, yeah. Sorry, I hope that you know that that's just the beginning of a convo. We got to jam further on.
Yeah,
But
I just wanted to say, it'll put new meaning to how much $1 costs.
Good point. That's a deep cut for any Kendrick fans. Maybe Alex?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to follow on from Rahul and about emotion. And I think there's a misconception that, you know, we're moving towards more emotion when it's actually just a different type of emotion. Like I work in finance, as you said, you know, there's a different sort of emotion that comes with that. But anger and frustration and negativity are emotions in themselves, and these businesses are seen as very logical and lacking in emotion, but there's actually so much emotion. It's just that nobody knows how to deal with that, and nobody knows how to communicate that and say, like, look, I'm feeling, you know, you come up to your end of year review and you're like, actually, it's been COVID, I've been really struggling this year, or you've had long COVID or something like that, or something awful's happened. And it's almost like those sorts of old industries are completely devoid of, they try and make humans into machines when we're not. And I think that's where they're lacking. And I think that's so powerful to bring emotion in to the professional world, because I think that that would almost actually make better business models and better teams. So yeah, that's all I want to say.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's a really profound point, and you took the words out of my mouth. It's that emotion is not just about this feelings of, like, good feelings, feelings of belonging, feelings of being stimulated in some sense, but also so much to do with what we would more traditionally call like the shadow side of human nature. There is no industry, there is no human endeavor on Earth in the entire history of the planets that is devoid of emotion, because humans are involved, and so therefore emotion is. And I think that, as you've said, the key is the honest and clear communication of it and the tools for dealing with it, which, you know, we're seeing brought into more and more corporate spaces. But as Rahul noted, the incentives aren't necessarily aligned for doing that. And one of the reasons why I mentioned this notion of two zones, right, of having the sort of appropriate courtesy for more emotional, intuitive, insightful ways of interacting, and more analytical, clear, so-called objective or academic ways of interacting, is that we require both of them. And in, you know, like a very real way, you can't, like the rules are slightly different, right? We can talk about aligning incentives in extremely like sort of highly specific and very technically clear terms about, like, this is where the value flows of the smart contract go, and this is how you know, like, value is distributed in the ecosystem. This is how the token is produced. This is how many there are. This is the supply cap. All of these things are numeric, easy to quantify, and specific. Whereas, like, the emotional alignments of people, what Rahul mentioned, is much more difficult to conceive of, right? Because it's not really a conceptual thing. It's, as Paul Myberg says, perceptual knowledge, knowledge of things as they are, the ability to flow in the moment with another human being and respond intuitively, accurately, honestly, and lovingly to where they are. You know, there's no real good way, as far as I know, to codify that. You can't specify it in the same way that you can specify incentive alignment and mechanism design. So the real question is, like, what is the protocol for approaching the kinds of tools and spaces that we need in order to more readily see, communicate, and accept our emotions and our emotional being in the world, which has always been there. It doesn't matter what we've been doing. It's just that in certain industries and parts of human endeavor, it's been historically suppressed for various different reasons. Now that's no longer necessarily the case, particularly in Web3, and we're dealing with all of this emotional upsurge, right? Like, how are we going to handle human emotions which have always existed, but in clear, coherent, honest, accurate, and loving ways? And again, my submission for this is negation, right? Like, we don't accept racism, we don't accept violence, we don't accept intolerance. You say all of the things that are not acceptable in this space, and you carve out the empty space for what emotion and emotional being in the world really is. You know, it's this old concept from the Tao Te Ching, which also is a quote that begins this week's module. You know, in the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu talks about how it is the empty space inside a vessel that makes it useful. It is the empty space inside a wheel that allows it to turn. It is the empty space in things which gives it their true form and function. And this, for me, applies very directly to the emotional world. That, like, I'm not sure that I agree that we can align emotional incentives, because they are not there to be quantified, and they are not there to be conceptually spoken about in a distanced manner. They are perceptual experiences of being in the world. And the only way to kind of really create trust spaces for that kind of emotional connection between human beings is to say what is not appropriate or courteous in this space. And that then allows for what is to flourish in beautiful and unexpected ways.
I love that. I love that. I wonder if Tony, I know Tony has some history. Maybe Tony, if you don't, I know had your hand raised. You've been a part of some intentional communities in the past, and I really resonates with me, the negation approach, because there's so many different norms that a community can have, and some of them are unspoken, but the negation definitely helps. But Tony, feel free to take it wherever you may be keen.
I think for me, I see quorum sensing as, a fundamental, like, biological semiotic, and our differences, they manifest as, the feeling of alienation or separation. And I think we're reflexively designed to have an aversion to alienation and separation. And what we have now with these new technologies is we're no longer beholden to, like, biological, to like physical locality in how we quorum sense. We're creating these sort of, like, quantized methods of quorum sensing across time and space. And for me, that's what drives so much of this emotionality, is these feelings of alienation and separation that used to be something I was averse to are now in a trust-filled space where we have limitations on the things that used to hurt about alienation, the racism and all those other feelings of separation. We have limits on those so we can share openly and find quorum where we couldn't before. And I think that's, for me, the most powerful part of blockchain, is that kind of quantized quorum sensing, whether you're talking about an intentional community or, at large across all people space.
That's really fascinating insight, Tony. For those who don't know, semiotics is how signs impact our consciousness. It's one of the most fascinating fields of study. And I wonder, Tony, if you have any further thoughts on what kind of signs in these non-localized digital spaces allow us to better sense how the other is responding to what we're saying, how quorum is being developed, what kind of truth is being cultivated in spaces where you don't have embodiments, right? Where you can't pick up on the signs of the bodies. What signs are most effective here?
I don't know that there is a single answer there, because we're creating like a sort of a meta larger space where radical subjectivity is allowed, and our space and our truth is one, and there's space for other truths that may be completely antipodal to ours. So I don't think there is one key set of truths. I don't know. That's a hard one for me, because I think I never want to disallow space for anyone, even if they are supposedly toxic or what have you. There's still a need for understanding, a need for them to sense quorum, and there's something to be learned from the larger ecosystem about that. I'm not quite sure I have a full thought on that.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's really, really great. And last question, if you're willing, you say we were reflexively designed to engage in quorum sensing. Is there a designer?
Yes, and we are it, a manifestation of it, universe sensing itself. I don't know. That's a morning questions. Goodness gracious, I'm gonna have my head spinning all day.
Wonderful. Thank you. So that's a really beautiful, beautiful answer. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah. Maybe Stefania, if you're willing.
Yeah, so I mean, this is great stuff. The problem that I'm thinking is like what we are trying to look at is a different way to communicate and between each other, and that is gonna reflect that in our financial system, in our society, how we are gonna break these the current system. That's my question, because now even from so we are understanding that basically when we talk to people now is like we are trying to say what we think, so we are very much focused on ourselves, on our truth, on what we believe, and we don't listen, right? That was basically one of the main takeaways, where we should actually try to have a different kind of conversation where we listen to other people. But how we are going to break that cycle, and that comes back also on some other work that I was doing about the concept of money, and perhaps a change from the petrodollar system, which we are kind of seeing an end to another kind of monetary system where the currency reserves is not going to be money printing, but is actually going to be perhaps a valuable assets such as a forest or something more environmental that in the past we never thought was valuable. So we never actually built a money system that was based on environment because it was out there, it was given for granted. Where now that this is started to get damaged by the humanity, by ourselves, after so much time, we are realizing how nature is valuable, it starts to become scarce. So perhaps that could become, I'm not saying a reserve currency, but could become the assets that back the money, if that kind of makes sense. So I'm not sure if it makes sense what I'm trying to say, but I've been doing some reflection about the money system, and we went from a gold standard to a petrodollar system. And now with cryptocurrency, we are trying to find our other, and also with all the money printing, we are trying to reflect about another way to bring a reserve currency, which it doesn't have to be there. It can be actually something different. And I've been thinking about it and talking to people, and some they say, well, the debt system, it will never going to change. It will always be debt. But if we want to promote financial inclusion and empower countries, they find it hard to live on a debt system. Maybe putting other kind of assets that will help actually them and will help to change the system in a better way. I mean, it's big question. That's why, you know, it's very difficult even to articulate them. So
It is. Thank you for trying. And it's the biggest question in some sense, particularly in this context. And what I would say is that, you know, in a later module, one of the arguments put forward is don't fight the system, just abandon it. And it comes not from a flippant way of engaging with this, but from deep anarchistic roots, which is to say that what thinking in terms of systems does, while it's an incredibly powerful way of broadening one's perspective, the kinds of thoughts which are possible when you still think within the conditions of a given system are always ones of, even if they're ones of resistance, they presuppose the system which they're resisting, right? So the classic example of this is people protesting on the streets in the US. And some people had the approach of dressing in black, looting shops, breaking the windows, and charging the police. And this is speaking the same language with which the police have been trained to deal with, right? And so inevitably there's a confrontation, there's violence, the people get beaten up because the police are always more well armed. There's some controversy and then it moves on, right? Whereas the anarchists' approach was to dress as fairies and go and tickle the police with feather dusters. Right? This now sounds completely absurd, but what it actually does is it confronts that line of police with their arms, with a kind of framework and a way of being, which is fundamentally at odds with their violent language and their violent way of being in the world. Another way of speaking about this is to say that the real protest is not to resist the system or to try and break the system. The real protest is to live as if you are already free. And if you're doing that, then all of a sudden, those around you can be set free to live as if they were already free within the context of their own lives without specifying or compelling them into another institution, into another way of being that comes from something external to them. And more, if we can encourage people not to see only what is external to them, the system that needs to be broken or fought against, but find that internal freedom, then we can live in a more coherent and interconnected world. This is not to say that we can like ignore the evils and the shortcomings of the petrodollar system. It's heinous, and it is in many respects a crime against humanity. And it's not to say that we shouldn't speak truth to that power. But what is the primary impulse of our own being in the world? It's to live as if we are already free.
And I think that's a great point. It makes me thinking about religion, and and I know some people might not be religious, but the way that Jesus went out, he went out living the life the way he thought. And then it was these things about education. So trying to live as we are free with our value and build like a parallel type of world or type of system, and try to get as many people as we can to come on board. Maybe that is the way.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefania. That was an awesome question and dialogue to start. Much more to come there. I think Antonio and Tegan are for sure the last two. We might, if you put in the chat whether you'd prefer us to keep going versus breaking out, I'd love to know from people in the audience. But Antonio, please go ahead. Tegan after that, and then we'll decide from there.
Hey, I'm very happy to hear all this talk about emotion within the tech world, because I come from, me as a dancer, I come from, a profession in which we actually quantify emotion within a very rigorous method. So let's say, when you're doing a ballet, you're not only supposed to do 6 pirouettes to the outward part of your body, but you're also supposed to look very happy and then all of a sudden sad. And it's that kind of like paradoxical thing that kind of makes dance or any art form that goes with methodology. It kind of creates this certain, what they say, like the je ne sais quoi, or like the émerveillement, like the being completely triggered, but in a good way on something, creating a resound. And one of the things from the talk that for me made me more think about like what are the possibilities of actually equating emotional intelligence within our systems is when we talked about this quantum thoughts, and there's this sort of like slash that I even put here in my notes that is like the gray areas and the clear systems. So I think I will just more say it as a question, is that if it is possible that like emotional intelligence actually helps us to create a shift between certain things that should be gray areas and other things that actually have been gray areas, but they should be clear systems. So, we should be able to like have clear systems in which racism, homophobia, xenophobia, pollution and all these things, this has to be somehow dealt in a clear system, whereas things that we've always dealt in very clear ways, like you're supposed to work and you're supposed to be productive and you're supposed to give more, and we don't care about that, whatever it is that you're feeling. So that is just the question, like, can we actually use, because it is so possible to create systems that that, you know, that help us to bind and to verify these things. So if we can also yeah, I think that's my point. Like, how can we shift, you know, the things that are clear and shouldn't be clear, and the gray areas that we have that should be clear.
I mean, I find it fascinating that you have such experience with embodying in a clear way what emotions and the kind of emotional intelligence that builds up in your own like way of expressing, which is not necessarily verbal, right? That's like one of the sort of key takeaways from what you said for me, is that the clear system for expressing emotion in many cases, perhaps not all of them, but in many, certainly in my own life, is the body, not the mouth. Right? Not the larynx is probably a more clear way to say it. And how that relates to, you know, sort of being able to quantify in a coherent sense emotional intelligence and use it to build more inclusive spaces is a fascinating question that I have absolutely no idea about. But I think it's really, really worth asking, and one that would be like a really interesting direction to pursue, because my sense of it is that, like, you know, with the sort of oncoming quantified self and more embodied ways of being in virtual spaces that we're going to see over the next 20 years, that it will be critical that we have like clear means of tapping into that emotional intelligence and using it, and not using it, but being with it, right? Like often when I have these kind of conversations, the other thing I would say about this is that there's a certain kind of trust involved, which we are never taught, and we are never even told that it's important to have, but like a certain kind of trust involved that sometimes you don't need to express all of the emotion. You just need to feel it cleanly and clearly, you know, totally. Like you need to totally embody that emotion, and then it's there because that's what they are. They're felt, they're not talked about necessarily, although they can be. And that's something that's just interesting to me in that sense of like, how do you know, we talked a lot about trust today, but how do we, in this pursuit of self-knowledge, build the trust within ourselves to feel completely the emotions that arise? You know, many of the great traditions and a lot of the things that I'm interested in outside of crypto will talk about how the masters of these traditions, whether it's Zen or Tantra, which couldn't be more opposed, these people don't not feel emotion. They feel it totally, and it burns up immediately as a result of that. So they can catch it in the moment, and they don't end up expressing anger and then feeling like regret or these kinds of things. It's just that the way in which they process that emotion is different from those who have not sort of actively pursued meditative practice and ways of being in the world which are more effective. So like the tantric master has the arrow of emotion fired at him, and he lets it hit his body, and he dances and then kind of lets it out in another direction that does no harm to anyone. And the Zen master sits there completely still, eyes closed, and he has the emotion, the arrow of emotion fired at him. And at the last second, he catches it and he just puts it down and carries on sitting there quietly. And both of these people, both of these personas feel emotion completely, right? But to me, that's what it means in some sense to like use emotion, is to trust yourself to feel it, to go into it completely. And then in that, it burns up and does the work that it needs to in the body, such that one can, you know, effectively, coherently, compassionately engage with the world.
Amazing. Cool. We'll do one more from Tegan, and I think we will try a breakout. The breakout will go a little over, so don't feel like you have to stay if you don't want to, but we're going to start the breakout in maybe 5-ish minutes after Tegan and Andy or anyone wants to chime in. Davis loves you, Andy, is the message from the chat. And the breakouts, again, are optional. If you have anything else for Slack after we can general. But Tegan, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll try to be quick so we get to the breakout. Mohammed's upstairs and I can hear my echo. Please turn your computer down. Yeah, when we were talking about a lot about, you can't change the system or don't try to change the system, abandon it or even master slave money. I think the first place my heart went was I'm 100% an abolitionist. I think about things that even happened this year, the NSARS movement, the Free Senegal movement, Haiti, the first country to fight for independence, still fighting for their liberation. I think about people in Palestine, but I also think about like my little brother who just started college and is this super creative designer, and my little cousin who's in middle school who loves creating games on Roblox. And I think that my research in blockchain and the ecological impact of technology overall as well kind of led me down the rabbit hole that even brought me to quantum. So it's really interesting to see that theme be present here as well. And quantum actually led me to another term, which is ethnomathematics. And the message I kind of dropped in the chat was people make culture. Define yourself with the lifestyle that attracts a community you can trust. And I'll probably share it in the Slack if anyone's interested, but I found like one really good research paper on ethnomathematics that kind of describes how culture really does influence math, and math and science really does build a society or civilization. So that's one direction my mind went. I also wrote a poem during this that I want to read. It's really lame and corny and very short, but hopefully somebody likes it. The art and science of a win-win game. The only game I like to play is lost in an underworld with budding fragments connected in an array, where cities ponder why, surrounded by a block web. Where is the sun to light the sky, to give the light that guides the way? To my friends and family, it seems far away. So until they can see my love for the sun, I'll mimic its light to share the answers I seek until the day my answers find me. Okay, thanks, y'all.
Tegan, you gotta put that in the chat. Amazing. Thank you. You were there during this? No way.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't know if there's anything left to say, to be honest. Thank you, Tegan. Thank you. Yeah, we need that in Slack. You blew up the chat. You broke the kernel Slack, or you broke the kernel Zoom. Good thing Mohammed turned down his volume. It ended up in such a spiral of moments. Man, okay. Thank you, everybody. Truly, truly, truly. It means so much that you've been here. Thanks to everyone who spoke and shared. And our hope is that the environment is like this every week. No one's gonna ever be forced into sharing, but hopefully it's an enjoyable space to just think and see how these things affect you and matter to you. That's the hope. And of course, our big thanks to Andy. If anyone wants to stay, we'll do the breakouts. We'll put a limit on it because it's already gonna go over. This is a theme on Fireside Day. We always go like 10 minutes over. So we're gonna do a 20-minute breakout, which means we'll go 10 minutes over. Don't feel like you have to stay. Feel free to drop early and hang out on Slack for the first part of the next 10 minutes if you wanna hang out there. If you had something that you shared in the chat that you want to pass on, and Tegan, you're the only one who doesn't have a choice, please put your poem in the Slack. Please put it in there. All the new words, all the ideas. I think Kernel General will be a great place for people to go back to those. And yeah, if you're staying, I'll see you in the breakout. And thank you everyone for being here for this first week.
Yay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Wow.
So much love. So much love.
Thank you. Thank you. Cool. I think Sachin has kicked off the breakouts. So you should be able to join those with the 20-minute limits. Feel free to pop in. Feel free to pop in. We'll see you guys at the tables. You should also be able to move around. And I'm also, I think, going to hang out here for a second.